Hello and welcome back to another update where I cover the latest developments throughout the front line in the Russo-Ukrainian war. It is your host Whip Union, and in this one we have several Russian advances across the front line, mainly focused around the area between Pokrovsk and Velikonovosilka. The Russians have also made a small advance in the Kharkiv region near the border area between Russia and Ukraine, entering the settlement of Tyre for the first time in about half a year. Starting out in the direction of Velikonovosilka, the Russians have managed to capture the settlement of Remivka to the west of the town, and with this the Russians now have control over every single settlement except for Velikonovosilka in the Vermevsky Ledge area. The Russians have been advancing towards Velikonovosilka from the northwestern, northeastern, eastern, southern, and southwestern directions, all to gain control over the town by step-by-step encirclement of it. The current roads for Ukraine in and out of the town is simply nothing. There is no road. There is the Mokry Yeli River here to the northwest, where there is no bridge across. It means you'll have to create river crossings. The Russians are within very close proximity both in the northern and southern flanks, meaning that the area in which they can even create crossings is very limited. The Ukrainians have fortified positions northwest of Velikonovosilka, which allows them to defend this area. However, the Russians, with their close proximity to it, allows them to hit any of the Ukrainian attempts to go in and out of the town, and therefore the Ukrainian forces are operationally encircled within Velikonovosilka, and their only exit is to make a river crossing across an open field where the Russians have fire control. This means that the Ukrainian positions in Velikonovosilka will likely not last much longer with the Russian advances in the area. Gaining control over Velikonovosilka will begin the next stage of the Russian operations in this area, and that is to turn Velikonovosilka into their own supply hub in this southwestern outskirts of the Donetsk region. At the same time, they will also be able to start launching offensive operations towards the next lines of defense to the north. These are two remaining lines of defense which remains under Ukrainian control before the Russians gain full control over the southwestern outskirts of the Donetsk region. The Russians have also managed to advance in the western flanks of Kurakhove towards Dashne, both from the southern flank and the northern flank of Dashne, gaining control over the waste heaps and water treatment plants northeast of Dashne and the fortified positions southeast of Dashne, both to gain a foothold in the southern outskirts and in the eastern outskirts of the town. The Russians with this have started the battle over Dashne, which is one of two remaining settlements in this pocket west of Kurakhove, the towns of Vuhledar and Dashne. The Russians with this operation is attacking both from the northern flank and from the southern flank, combining their forces from the flanks of Kurakhove for a common push towards Dashne, gaining control of which will allow the Russians to continue advancing along the main highway towards the fortified position in between the two towns, and then finally Vuhledar. At the same time, we're seeing advances by the Russians in the southern flank near Yantarne, which could advance further towards the southern flank of Vuhledar, and at the same time we see fighting on the eastern outskirts of Andrivka. The Russians have also managed to capture the remaining parts of Slovianka and the surrounding area, capturing the forest line next to it, and with this they continue offensive operations towards the main highway, where we have seen further advances by the Russians with the control over the remaining parts of Yasenova, and a push towards Novandrivka, both from the northern and southern flanks of the town, as the Russians continue their operations in the western direction at the same time as they continue in the southern direction. The Russians are here with two objectives: gain control over the villages in between the two defensive lines southwest of Pokrovsk in the Donetsk region, to gain full control over the entirety of the Donetsk region, but also to advance down south along the main highway towards the flank of the fortified line south of Pokrovsk, and at the same time continue along the fortified positions from the eastern direction, both in the southern and northern defensive lines in between Pokrovsk and Kurakhove. Russians have already managed to make Kurakhove their own supply hub, as is evident with their new offensive operations west of the town, and will likely see continuous momentum of the Russian forces in the western direction that will increase with the time that comes. The Russians are also continuing the offensive operations west of Pokrovsk, both in an advance towards the city itself, but also to advance along the highway and the railway in both directions to gain full control of it, The objective of the Russians is to make use of it for further offensive operations towards Pokrovsk itself, gain control over the towns in the area of Udashne and Kotlina, and gain control over the coal mine, which is one of the largest coal mines in Ukraine. It is modernized, it's well developed, and the Ukrainians have stopped production of it due to the close proximity of the Russian forces, which has limited the steel production of Ukraine. The Russians here on the western flank of Pokrovsk are focusing on the two towns along the main highway, which is Kotlina and Udashne. The Russians have managed to gain control over the eastern bus stop here in the southeast of Udashne. With this, they've gained a foothold within the town and fighting has begun over it. It is somewhat isolated from the town itself, therefore the Russians likely focus on moving on to the northern parts as well, and then push onto the rail station in the central parts of the town, gaining control of which will allow the Russians to gain control over the town itself, from which they'll move towards the coal mine in the northern parts. At the same time, the Russians have managed to push further within Kotlina, gain control over the railway there, and moving into the industrial area in the northeastern parts to gain control over the remaining parts of Kotlina, which will be the final town ahead of Pokrovsk from the western direction. The Russians will then launch further offensive operations along the main railway and highway towards the western flank of Pokrovsk and begin the battle of the city from the western direction. The Russians are also advancing further northwest of Pishane to connect with their forces along the main highway to gain control over these fortified positions from their weak points, where they've managed to gain control over the fortified positions near Svirove in the northwestern direction, both the ones in the intersection and at the outskirts of the village. The Russians here also continued offensive operations along the towns of Svirove, Leonotovichi, and so on to gain access to Pokrovsk from the southwestern direction. Therefore, we see on the western flank, Pokrovsk is within the last line of defense before the Russians gain access to the city itself. Pokrovsk itself is a small city at the size of Bakhmut. We see that there is some apartment complex areas in the southern parts and in the central parts. There's an industrial area in the northwestern parts, and there's mostly just regular residential areas all across the city. The rail network is the most significant part of the city, but as for defensive capability, it is inferior to Bakhmut. Bakhmut was superior in two terms. The apartment complex areas were very well centered around areas such as the western citadel area within the city. If we take a look at that, we see that these areas are much more defensible. The railway that moves through the central parts separated the eastern and western parts and also had a large industrial area. At the same time, it was within close proximity to Jazov Yar, which is located on the high ground overlooking the entire city. Therefore, Bakhmut was very well defensible. This took the Russians, the Wagner forces, a very long time to gain control over the city, as they had to fight over every single building. And at that point, the Ukrainians had a lot more manpower, a lot more resources, a lot more firepower, and so on to deal with Russian forces. Now, the Ukrainian armed forces are weaker than they were back then. They're more skilled, but they have less manpower and they have less equipment than they had back then. And therefore, a battle over the city would have less quality and less quantity of Ukrainian forces, while at the same time, the city itself is less defensible. There's the southern outskirts with the high-rise apartment complex area, which overlooks the defensive lines, which is very defensible for the Ukrainians. But if the Russians simply enter from the western direction, they'll be able to move through the urban areas and flank the apartment complex areas from the north, and gaining control over the railways will allow the Russians to simply isolate and encircle the Ukrainian forces here, moving into the southern parts of Vuhledar through the railways and gaining control over a eastern flank and moving through the railways from the western flank as well. The Russians would be able to separate Pokrovsk into two parts, and the northern parts is simply completely indefensible. There's no significant defensive positions from which the Ukrainians can operate, while in the southern parts it's much more defensible. And at the same time, simply cutting off the railways will significantly limit the supplies of the Ukrainians in and out of the city, akin to the road of death west of Bakhmut. And the situation is simply much more complicated for the Ukrainians in Pokrovsk than Bakhmut itself. And most importantly, there's no Jazov Yar in the area around Pokrovsk. There's no high ground from which the Ukrainians can operate from. And the Russians are in a position where the balance of power is much more in their favor compared to Bakhmut, and Bakhmut is marked as one of the few turning points of the war where prior to the Battle of Bakhmut, the Russians were actually weaker than the Ukrainians. And following the Battle of Bakhmut, the Russians became stronger because it allowed them time to build up their forces. Moving on to the Kharkiv section of the area, we see that the Russians managed to enter Tigray again in more than half a year. They started a push towards the forest patch and the settlements in the northern bank of the Vuhledar river line. It seems that the Russians may be looking to restart offensive operations, gain control of the northern bank. Maybe the Ukrainians have started redirecting their forces away from Vovchansk, and therefore they want to increase their pressure to keep them here. Or potentially they may be seeing a weakness in the Ukrainian forces. In either case, this is just a small attack, a probing attack into the Ukrainian forces to see what sort of response they will hold. All in all, we see that the main push and main efforts of the Russians is focused in the Donetsk region, as was the case a month ago, and they have managed to make significant gains in this area, but in other sections of the front line, the gains are much more insignificant. And that is going to be all for this update. Thank you all for watching. Make sure to leave a like, subscribe, check out my Patreon and YouTube membership for additional content. Thank you all for watching and have a great day.